What happens when two minds govern the same body? Can parasites dictate my identity? Can the mind be replicated? And how can a self retain an identity when it is in this constant state of flux? In this chapter, we investigate a 21st century view of the metaphysical self and ask, can it stand up against the ever-shifting nature of eternity? So join me as I attempt to unpick the infinities of what is. We all tend to assume that, at very least, our own personal and private understanding of the self should be, for lack of a better word, correct. As if it were in alignment with some fundamental truth. Because at whatever stage of life this self may be, the path followed has always been one of our own design, determined by the choices and actions of this self. No one knows who we are better than we do ourselves, right? But as discussed in our story concerning Soldier Pink Moss, identifying the decision maker is not always so easy. And the more we look, the more evident this identity crisis becomes. Mental disruptions by way of tumours, psychosis, and diseases like Alzheimer's, or even unseen external influences, all offer examples of how easily the ownership of self can be jeopardized. A single-celled parasite known as toxoplasmosis is one such external influence. This miraculous creature has evolved the remarkable ability to influence the mind of its host. Though found in many warm-blooded animals, it commonly finds residence within mice and rats. The curious effect this parasite has over its victim is revealed when the mice begin to show changes in their behaviour. They become less fearful and more likely to take risks. As a result, one by one, these poor mice out in the open with the bravado of an African lion inevitably get caught and eaten by cats. An act that may at first seem disastrous for the parasite, but cunningly, all that results is a more luxurious, cat-sized lodging. You may have also seen similar approaches taken by certain fungi that turn ants into zombies so as to catch themselves a free flight on the next opportunistic bird. But what you may not know is that you personally have a 1 in 3 chance of being infected by toxoplasmosis, as somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the human population are currently infected. And though studies are still underway, it's also theorized that these traits of fearlessness transition to us higher mammals just as effectively. But rather than being eaten by cats, this slight edge towards fearlessness may result in a high-speed collision or perhaps a successful business venture. Either way, the question remains: how do we know what is us and what is the parasite? And even if we knew we were infected, would we even want for such a thing to be removed? Though we take the ownership of our self-identity very seriously, its state seems very much at the whim of physical chance. Following 2010, both my mother and sister were independently diagnosed and successfully treated for brain tumours. The difference in how they were affected primarily resulted from where each tumour was located. My mother's was located at the rear of the brain, surrounding neural pathways that connect distance representation with spatial memory. And though she quickly recovered, shortly after the surgery, she found herself forgetting how to navigate familiar spaces. Occasionally, she might fresh air a familiar step or forget what the appropriate course of action is when walking towards a wall until it was too late, which I'm sure we're all agreed isn't funny at all. Whereas my sister, whose operation had taken place behind the eyes on the optic nerve beside the prefrontal cortex, experienced a minor but permanent shift in her personality. In her own words, her experience of the world just became more black and white, a shift from the lateral towards the literal. Subtle humour or between-the-lines phrasing were no longer grasped intuitively, and this, in parallel with a reduction of a once feisty nature, did for some time make simple things like small talk a much more laborious endeavour. But importantly, unto herself, she still always feels like herself. Though the emotional lens of self may have shifted, her self-identification has never deterred. Our moment-to-moment belief that we are the one and the same I that started our story seems to the individual as unshakable. I think, therefore I am. I must be real because not only can I remember being me, but I'm experiencing it right at this very moment. This experience, this moment, it must be true. However, there are countless records of people waking from comas and other cases of brain trauma, not only with new traits or behaviours, but with entirely new identities, each with a complete set of false memories and backstories, eradicating the familiarity of old friends and family. There's even a syndrome that can result from left hemisphere damage called acquired savant syndrome, which leaves individuals with extraordinary scholarly skills. Be it mathematics, music, art, the sciences or language, patients can become entirely fluent from a starting point of practically zero knowledge. But if physical trauma can etch new psychological selves into our physical, does this not then reveal to us an underlying truth about the nature of self? Perhaps even a terrifying truth. That the self of our experience is no more than a story told by the brain to the mind. A story that includes the existence of the mind itself. A mind that, regardless of evidence, will always believe its story. Terrifying because, as we know, the brain lies. A procedure developed in the 1960s shows this trait firsthand. Still in practice today, this amazingly dramatic procedure is practiced for the purpose of alleviating the severity of epileptic seizures. In studies led by neuropsychologist, neurobiologist Roger Sperry, it was shown that seizures could be kept to a minimum if the spreading misfiring neurons were contained to just one side of the brain. To achieve this, patients participated in a surgery that literally had their brain split in two. This cutting of the corpus callosum worked as a type of neural firebreak, removing the bridge that ties our two hemispheres together. As reported by patients and when viewed from the outside, these operations seemed by and large a success. But Sperry's discoveries were soon to open a perspective of the self entirely unexpected. After the recovery period, patients would report situations where, upon getting dressed, they would, as usual, decide on an outfit, reach out with their right hand, and take the chosen garment, only to have their left hand step in and also select its preferred item of clothing. And though patients knew in themselves that this wasn't right, it now appeared that two separate selves were governing their bodies, each unconcerned and, for the most part, unaware of the preferences held by the other. Due to contralateral control, each hemisphere governs the body's opposite side. So, for example, the left brain controls the right arm and vice versa, with each side attributing its own unique set of abilities. The following 3 tests in which split brain patients participated show how our mind is less of an individual and more of a delicate balance between these varied mental abilities. Test 1 involved blindfolding patients and placing objects in their hands. As the left hemisphere is the only one of the two that retains the power of speech, subjects were fully capable of verbally identifying the item held in their right hand. But when asked to identify what was in their left, they couldn't say. But where things got weird was when they were asked to use their left hand to draw this unknown item, which they could do, even though none could explain why they had chosen that particular item to draw. When asked, patients would either state that they didn't know, or more often, create a false memory to justify some story that could account for it. Equally, if patients removed their blindfold, the left hand could pick the item from a lineup, whereas the verbally gifted right couldn't. This same hemisphere independence was revealed again in their vision due to the eye's ability to send equal amounts of left and right information to the relevant side of the visual cortex. In split-brain patients, this visual information is smuggled to its opposing side via an unsevered pathway called the optic chasm. In the test, patients were required to focus on a dot in the centre of a screen until an image flashed on either side. As the image only remained on screen for a moment, patients had no time to shift their focus, thus restricting all peripheral information to the correlated hemisphere. And like the objects in the hand, patients could only verbalise what they saw on the right, but only draw or write what they saw on the left. Where right brain wins out over left is that it's the only one of the two that can recognise faces. This was demonstrated in the third and final test, where patients were shown paintings by the 16th century painter Giuseppe Arcimboldo, famous for painting works of simple household items like fruit or books that have a face reflected within the composition. Patients with their chatty left brain could only state that they saw books and fruit, whereas the right brain, by way of the left hand, could communicate the presence of a hidden face. Sperry's discoveries have had far-reaching consequences, as they showcase a quality of hemisphere independence that is present within us all. Behind the curtain, unbeknown to the audience that is the eye, works a cast of players, each responsible for their key roles, sometimes out front, sometimes backstage, sometimes stepping up as understudies to fill in for disastrous unforeseen dropouts, all so that our conscious eye can experience the flawless performance that we call the self. Even with such bizarre side effects, patients still report minimal interruptions to their daily lives because the show must go on. Left brain simply goes on lying to itself, confidently justifying all of right brain's unexpected impulses. Because as far as any were concerned, just as it was with my sister, all were still themselves. But who then is it, sitting silently in the neighbouring hemisphere? Another I? The answer appears to be yes. Two self-appointed I's, each as happy to disregard the other, just as we happily disregard the many schisms of our own psyche. And so, as the empirical evidence rolls in, time and again, in sickness and health, it appears that our experiences, interpretations, and identities are nothing more than the results of this physically influenceable biological machine, making it all the more reasonable to think that the self, thus far sought, may indeed be a purely physical entity. The modern acceptance of materialism is beginning to make a lot of sense. But though the idea of self as a purely physical construct seems to align with the results of these experiments, we can still challenge this newfound faith with some further philosophical probing. For example, it gives credence to the idea that with enough technical prowess, one should be able to remap an entire human brain, and in doing so, acquire the ability not only to store the experience, but to replicate it. This opens up many questions about the nature of self that we too must soon dive into. But before we get too carried away with the philosophical, let us just first find our next shoreline in understanding. What level of fidelity have we achieved in our hows of the brain? And how close are we to digitally replicating a human mind? Well, as one may suspect, in this era of exponential development, such a task is already underway, in part as the ongoing study dubbed the Human Connectome Project, or HCP. Since 2010, the HCP has been collating data that will inevitably be that very map's genesis. Prior to this project, the most commonly used model of the cerebral cortex was that published by German neurologist Corbinian Brodmann over 100 years ago in 1909. As put by HCP founder David Van Essen, this was analogous to a pilot using 16th century maps for navigating the world today. Through the HCP, Van Essen and his team have been able to add a layer of fidelity to these maps, upgrading from the original 52 brain regions to an impressive 180, 97 of which were new to science. By illuminating these region-to-region structural pathways, we have enabled a much greater understanding of the correlations between neural activity and experience. Though as impressive as that is, this project has also revealed just how daunting the task of mapping a human brain is set to be. The core achievement of the HCP has been the mapping of what they affectionately refer to as the blobs of the brain, neuronal events that highlight the brain's connectivity at a macroscopic scale. Though considering the fact that each blob dances over 50,000 nerve cells and a billion synapses, it's not surprising that the fineness of detail required for a totalistic mapping should be closer to 2 quadrillion times those being achieved. Hence, the difference in technique used by Jeff Lichtman at Harvard University, who has taken it upon himself to tackle these finer degrees of detail, though nowhere has our technical limitations been so clear, as each cubic millimetre of mapping requires some 2,000 terabytes of data, which according to Lichtman would equate one entire blob with more digital information than is the digital content of the entire world. This is why it has taken Lichtman and his team 5 years to record a mere 3 billionth of a mouse brain. Unfortunately, the technique also requires a somewhat more intrusive approach. To achieve this level of detail, the initial cubic millimetre of brain must first be removed and filled with a metal called osmium, which causes the brain to harden. Then, just like a log of salami, micro-thin shavings are sliced off with a specialised diamond knife before being scanned and painstakingly colour-coded. After a total of 33,333 slices, the images are then stacked like a deck of cards into 3D imaging software, resulting in the technicoloured brainbow image, revealing a cityscape of dense synaptic beds, each filled with families of thousands of nerve cells. But even at this scale, scans can host hundreds of different cell types, each communicating uniquely across varied cerebral cortex layers. And so much like our earlier discussion on space, as beautiful as this is still only a static frame. Like the seemingly lifeless ghost towns captured by the slow exposures of early landscape photographers, these images are merely the backdrop to the activity, the highways through which chemical and electrical information flow. To truly witness a brain in action may only with perseverance and luck be known to future generations, yet to be tackled are the complications that shall arise with comparing one species to another, one individual to another, or even one individual as they change through time. To land the elusive self in measurement shall be no less challenging than landing the ever-changing universe. Because, like the universe, the The self is the ultimate moving target. Over the first few decades of life, the brain and mind alike are shaped by a repeated increase and decrease of synaptic density, cascading over the brain back to front like a Mexican wave. In the first year, our synaptic density produces an overcompensation of neural pathways, opening up opportunity for variety. But in order to conform to any one of the myriad environments that an individual finds themselves in, the synapses then begin to be pruned, encouraging pathways used and culling those of disuse. First in the rear, with a visual cortex, this pruning solidifies pathways associated with the senses. And as we come to terms with this new sensory input, the activity shifts forward over parts of the brain that define our motor skills. Finally, the wave reaches the brain's front, where our higher cognitive abilities, social skills, and self-identity become more defined, reaching a density peak at around our 4th year. And as we continue to age, it is this lessening of plasticity that defines our more rigid and decided natures later in life. This is also why the psychedelic experience, mentioned in the last chapter, can be such a shock to the system, as it evokes this once fluid connectivity of the early brain. But this lessening of plasticity isn't the reduction of our abilities, rather, this is our ability to specialize. So though we may be genetically entwined by this same underlying process, we shall always find our experience of self to be infinitely unique, so long as this process is shaped by the necessity to specialize within an ever-moving world. But as all of this highlights, it is precisely this movement in terms of the unfolding process that we should be investigating. Not simply the nature of individual parts and the mechanics of closed systems. Because, as it was with all other cases of natural emergence thus far examined, be it the nature of bodies, life, atoms, or minds, these structures always come to be via patterns of process, not ticks of clocks or throws of switches. Beyond the parts are their relationships, which are themselves responsible for the emergence of broader wholes of process. As the individual must change in order to live, so must the species. And in fact, so is this true of the planet or any living system. For a system to hold an identity, it must incorporate an aspect of change. Otherwise, it simply fails. Though what does all of this say for the prized individuality of self? Well, it does in part justify the biological description of this self, because in much the same way that genomic differences in our DNA reflect our seemingly unending variety of appearances, these connectomic differences of the brain, once mapped, may also reveal how a simple biological system can conjure an infinite of unique personalities, even though each individual springs from the exact same inanimate matter, built upon the same genetic history, using the same physical laws. Further, it highlights how our individualism ultimately reflects the individualism found in our environments, threading us into the whole via a tapestry of order and chaos. An idea that might again justify the process of self, but not, however, the unity of self. Thus far, the finite bound needed to provide this self with any ultimate ground has eluded us. Because again, like it is in genomics, where things appear clear, definable, and more importantly, quantifiable at the macro scale, it's the blurry borders of the microscopic that we must first understand before adequately describing a digital version of self. As said, a snapshot of parts is not enough to fully explain the phenomenon. So even if we were able to successfully land the digital representation of self, whatever its nature, it's clear that its identity must be fluid, with the same laws of plasticity and change that are inherent in all physical systems. But where then does this theory of self leave the once globally accepted concept of an eternal self? What it seems is that we have the ability to experience reality through many eyes in one lifetime, due to a continuous complexification of the universe, which, again, never finds any state of totality. As our species emerged in non-digital increments in response to an ever-changing environment, so did this self. Thus, we are of the whole as the whole is of us, an idea that may lean our theory of self into the eternal, but perhaps shy it away from its independence and unity. Due to archetypal structures of our evolution, we are each born capable of assimilating into our environment via our tendency toward specialization, a perfect scenario for any finite entity. If the mind did have the ability to live on into eternity in some version of mind that forewent the inevitable deterioration process, it would soon prove clear that this once useful trait of specialization would inevitably be its downfall. As its world continued to change, and as minds evolved in ways not yet imagined, it would prove that without changing the boundaries of what this self is, the more rigid, self-assured experiencer would soon find themselves incapable of communicating or even participating in these future societies. Let me offer an example of what I mean here. It's commonly agreed that if we were to take a prehistoric child of 100,000 years ago out of its environment and raised it in the modern world, we would be unable to distinguish them from any other person of the 21st century. However, if we travel any further back in time, we would begin to recognize our species' evolutionary limits, those key differences that make us human and our more ancient ancestors not human. So in the case of an eternal mind, perhaps at first an individual could learn the ways of their future society, acquiring a level of mental development twice that between a child and adult. But eventually, without external intervention, and importantly, without changing what we identify as the self, the division would become insurmountable. Because what the human mind provides for is a lifetime, not an eternity. Any suggestion of an experience outside of these parameters requires a continuation of change that, if given enough time, would inevitably lead to an entity that shares little more than a name with the you of now. This and a false belief of selfhood. Either change is an endless attribute of all entities, thus leaving finitely bound concepts like selves little more than temporary subjective frames, or selves end. And thus far, in regards to the latter, no such ultimate end or finite boundary can be identified. But we don't have to be so concerned with this changing of self, as we change every day, every second, every plank time even. Our most precious moments come and go, continually replaced by our new, most precious moments. Think about all the things you have loved with all your heart. Your favourite toy, game, best friend, first love. Even the dynamics of our families. These lives we once lived, they no longer exist. the most important thing in our world only a few short years ago, some forgotten even to ourselves, have been replaced by the latest incarnation of the story. And when it comes down to it, we are okay with this. We embrace it wholeheartedly. We want to grow, change, develop, and discover what's around the next bend. It is our experiences of love, appreciation, fear, and hate that direct our experience, moved ever forward by the overwhelming intimidation and the calming simplicity of every now. The unsettled desire and the contented satisfaction that blend to form our every moment, defining our path from one story to the next, explainable in some ways by the correlated physical events occurring at the microscopic level of the brain, and yet so much more on an emotional level of experience. So, yes, that which we experience as self has been undoubtedly connected to the happenings of the brain. And yes, with this brain being of physical nature, the self we know, like the rest of the universe, is in constant flux. But born of this flux, whatever its ultimate nature, comes the idea, the experience, the knowledge of self, one ever-changing, and one that we have the privilege of experiencing moment to moment. Though we may not yet have been able to determine any ultimate ground floor of self, mind, or even their associated physicality, we can at least take this simple lesson away from the halls of neuroscience: that all is connected in movement. That selves don't sit static above the world, but rather are a reflection of it. Indeed, they are its movement. There is a quote, often attributed to Einstein, though I doubt its authenticity. Still, I like it anyway. It reads, "There are two ways to live. You can live as if nothing is a miracle. You can live as if everything is a miracle." Now, this might be easy to say from the privileged position of someone not living in a war-torn country or a part of the world that the rest has forgotten. But this is the point. Miracles don't happen to the self from a place on high that is other, as all is connected. Thus, the emergence of self, mind, body, or any other version of form in whatever frame they might be considered, are equally the miraculous. Everything is a miracle. But before we get too carried away with patting ourselves on the back for recognizing the obvious, let me point out that I have been far from clear as to what a miracle actually is. Miracle comes from the Latin miraculum, which simply means object of wonder. And thus far, objects of wonder are all we can confidently claim to have found, as the mirage of final boundaries is still ever present. Perhaps we have brought some clarity to the ancient question, are we the brain? But the final answer still seems uncertain, as we can now ask, are we the algorithm, the physical connections of synapses? Or are we the emergent idea, the spaces between the physical and, perhaps in some way, a thing all to itself?